Welcome to Soft Hour Library. Tonight's story begins now. Close your eyes and rest.
Chapter 11. Poirot pays a call. I was slightly nervous when I rang the bell at Marby Grange the following afternoon. I wondered very much what Poirot expected to find out. He had entrusted the job to me. Why was it because, as in the case of questioning Major Blunt, he wished to remain in the background? The wish, intelligible in the first case, seemed to me quite meaningless here. My meditations were interrupted by the advent of a smart parlour-maid. Yes, Mrs. Folliot was at home. I was ushered into a big drawing-room and looked round me curiously as I waited for the mistress of the house. A large bare room, some good bits of old china and some beautiful etchings, shabby covers and curtains. A lady's room in every sense of the term. I turned from the inspection of a Bartolozzi on the wall as Mrs. Folliot came into the room. She was a tall woman with untidy brown hair and a very winning smile. "Doctor Shepherd," she said hesitatingly. "That is my name," I replied. "I must apologize for calling upon you like this, but I wanted some information about a parlour-maid previously employed by you, Ursula But with the utterance of the name, the smile vanished from her face, and all the cordiality froze out of her manner. She looked uncomfortable and ill at ease. "Ursula Bourne," she said hesitatingly. "Yes," I said. "Perhaps you don't remember the name." "Oh, yes, of course. I remember perfectly. But she left you just over a year ago, I understand." Yes, she did. That is quite right. And you were satisfied with her whilst she was with you? How long was she with you, by the way?" "Oh, a year or two. I can't remember exactly how long." She is very capable. I'm sure you will find her quite satisfactory." "I didn't know she was leaving Fernley." "I hadn't the least idea of it." "But can you tell me anything about her?" I asked. "Anything about her?" "Yes, where she comes from, who her people are, that sort of thing." Mrs. Folliot's face wore more than ever its frozen look. "I don't know at all." "But who was she with before she came to you?" "I'm afraid I don't remember." But there was a spark of anger now underlying her nervousness. She flung up her head in a gesture that was vaguely familiar. "Is it really necessary to ask all these questions?" "Not at all," I said, with an air of surprise and a tinge of apology in my manner. "I had no idea you would mind answering them. I am very sorry." But her anger left her, and she became confused again. "Oh, I don't mind answering them. I assure you I do." "Why should I? It just seemed a little odd, you know." "That's all. A little odd. But one advantage of being a medical practitioner is that you can usually tell when people are lying to you. I should have known from Mrs. Folliot's manner, if from nothing else, that she did mind answering my questions, minded intensely. She was thoroughly uncomfortable and upset, and there was plainly some mystery in the background. I judged her to be a woman quite unused to deception of any kind, and consequently rendered acutely uneasy when forced to practice it. A child could have seen through her, but it was also clear that she had no intention of telling me anything further. Whatever the mystery centering around Ursula Bourne might be, I was not going to learn it through Mrs. Folliot. Defeated, I apologized once more for disturbing her, took my hat and departed. I went to see a couple of patients and arrived home about 6 o'clock. Caroline was sitting beside the wreck of tea things. She had that look of suppressed exultation on her face which I know only too well. It is a sure sign with her of either the getting or the giving of information. I wondered which it had been. "I've had a very interesting afternoon," began Caroline as I dropped into my own particular easy chair and stretched out my feet to the inviting blaze in the fireplace. "Have you?" I asked. "Miss Gannett drop in to tea. Miss Gannett is one of the chief of our newsmongers." "Guess again," said Caroline with intense complacency. I guessed several times, working slowly through all the members of Caroline's intelligence corps. My sister received each guess with a triumphant shake of the head. In the end, she volunteered the information herself. Poirot," she said. "Now what do you think of that?" I thought a good many things of it, but I was careful not to say them to Caroline. "Why did he come?" I asked. "To see me, of course. He said that knowing my brother so well, he hoped he might be permitted to make the acquaintance of his charming sister. Your charming sister, I've got mixed up, but you know what I mean." "But what did he talk about?" I asked. "He told me a lot about himself and his cases. You know that Prince Paul of Mauritania, the one who's just married a dancer?" "Yes." I saw a most intriguing paragraph about her in society snippets the other day, hinting that she was really a Russian Grand Duchess, one of the Tsar's daughters who managed to escape from the Bolsheviks. "Well, it seems that Poirot solved a baffling murder mystery that threatened to involve them both. Prince Paul was beside himself with gratitude. But did he give him an emerald tie-pin the size of a plover's egg?" I inquired sarcastically. "He didn't mention it." "Why?" "Nothing," I said. "I thought it was always done. It is in detective fiction anyway. The super detective always has his rooms littered with rubies and pearls and emeralds from grateful royal clients. But it's very interesting to hear about these things from the inside," said my sister complacently. It would be to Caroline. I could not but admire the ingenuity of Hercule Poirot, who had selected unerringly the case of all others that would most appeal to an elderly maiden lady living in a small village. "Did he tell you if the dancer was really a Grand Duchess?" I inquired. "He was not at liberty to speak," said Caroline importantly. I wondered how far Poirot had strained the truth in talking to Caroline. Probably not at all. He had conveyed his innuendos by means of his eyebrows and his shoulders. "And after all this," I remarked, "I suppose you were ready to eat out of his hand." "But don't be coarse, James. I don't know where you get these vulgar expressions from, but probably from my only link with the outside world, my patients. Unfortunately, my practice does not lie amongst royal princes and interesting Russian immigrés." But Caroline pushed her spectacles up and looked at me. "You seem very grumpy, James. It must be your liver. A blue pill, I think, tonight. But to see me in my own home, you would never imagine that I was a doctor of medicine. Caroline does the home prescribing both for herself and me." "Damn my liver," I said irritably. "Did you talk about the murder at all?" "Well, naturally, James. What else is there to talk about locally? I was able to set Poirot right upon several points. He was very grateful to me. He said I had the makings of a born detective in me, and a wonderful psychological insight into human nature. But Caroline was exactly like a cat that is full to overflowing with rich cream. She was positively purring. He talked a lot about the little grey cells of the brain and of their functions. His own, he says, are of the first quality. But he would say so, I remarked bitterly. Modesty is certainly not his middle name. But I wish you would not be so horribly American, James. He thought it very important that Ralph should be found as soon as possible, and induced to come forward and give an account of himself. He says that his disappearance will produce a very unfortunate impression at the inquest. And what did you say to that? I agreed with him, said Caroline importantly, and I was able to tell him the way people were already talking about it. Caroline, I said sharply, did you tell M. Poirot what you overheard in the wood that day? I did, said Caroline complacently. I got up and began to walk about. You realize what you're doing, I hope, I jerked out. You're putting a halter round Ralph Patton's neck, as surely as you're sitting in that chair. Not at all, said Caroline, quite unruffled. I was surprised you hadn't told him. I took very good care not to, I said. I'm fond of that boy. So am I. That's why I say you're talking nonsense. I don't believe Ralph did it, and so the truth can't hurt him, and we ought to give M. Poirot all the help we can. Why, think, very likely Ralph was out with that identical girl on the night of the murder, and if so, he's got a perfect alibi. If he's got a perfect alibi, I retorted, why doesn't he come forward and say so? Might get the girl into trouble, said Caroline sapiently. But if M. Poirot gets hold of her and puts it to her as her duty, she'll come forward of her own accord and clear Ralph. You seem to have invented a romantic fairy story of your own, I said. You read too many trashy novels, Caroline. I've always told you so. I dropped into my chair again. Did Poirot ask you any more questions? I inquired. Only about the patients you had that morning. The patients, I demanded unbelievingly. Yes, your surgery patients. How many and who they were? Do you mean to say you were able to tell him that? I demanded. Caroline is really amazing. Why not? Asked my sister triumphantly. I can see the path up to the surgery door perfectly from this window. And I've got an excellent memory, James. Much better than yours, let me tell you. I'm sure you have, I murmured mechanically. My sister went on, checking the names on her fingers. There was old Mrs. Bennet, and that boy from the farm with the bad finger, Dolly Grice to have a needle out of her finger, that American steward off the liner. Let me see, that's 4. Yes, and old George Evans with his ulcer. And lastly, she paused significantly. Well, Caroline brought out her climax triumphantly. She hissed in the most approved style, aided by the fortunate number of S's at her disposal. Miss Russell. She sat back in her chair and looked at me meaningly, and when Caroline looks at you meaningly, it is impossible to miss it. I don't know what you mean, I said quite untruthfully. Why shouldn't Miss Russell consult me about her bad knee? Bad knee, said Caroline. Fiddlesticks, no more bad knee than you and I. She was after something else. But what? I asked. Caroline had to admit that she didn't know. But depend upon it, that was what he was trying to get at, M. Poirot, I mean. There's something fishy about that woman, and he knows it. Precisely the remark Mrs. Ackroyd made to me yesterday, I said. That there was something fishy about Miss Russell. Said Caroline darkly, Mrs. Ackroyd, there's another. Another what? Caroline refused to explain her remarks. She merely nodded her head several times, rolled up her knitting, and went upstairs to don the high mauve silk blouse and the gold locket, which she calls dressing for dinner. I stayed there staring into the fire and thinking over Caroline's words. Had Poirot really come to gain information about Miss Russell, or was it only Caroline's tortuous mind that interpreted everything according to her own ideas? There had certainly been nothing in Miss Russell's manner that morning to arouse suspicion. At least, I remembered her persistent conversation on the subject of drug taking, and from that she had led the conversation to poisons and poisoning. But there was nothing in that. Ackroyd had not been poisoned. Still, it was odd. I heard Caroline's voice, rather acid in note, calling from the top of the stairs. "James, you will be late for dinner." I put some coal on the fire and went upstairs obediently. It is well at any price to have peace in the home. Chapter 12. Round the table. A joint inquest was held on Monday. I do not propose to give the proceedings in detail. To do so would only be to go over the same ground again and again. By arrangement with the police, very little was allowed to come out. I gave evidence as to the cause of Ackroyd's death and the probable time. The absence of Ralph Patten was commented on by the coroner, but not unduly stressed. Afterwards, Poirot and I had a few words with Inspector Raglan. The inspector was very grave. "It looks bad, Mr. Poirot," he said. "I'm trying to judge the thing fair and square. I'm a local man, and I've seen Captain Patten many times in Cranchester. I'm not wanting him to be the guilty one, but it's bad whichever way you look at it. If he's innocent, why doesn't he come forward? We've got evidence against him, but it's just possible that that evidence could be explained away. Then why doesn't he give an explanation?" A lot more lay behind the inspector's words than I knew at the time. Ralph's description had been wired to every port and railway station in England. The police everywhere were on the alert. His rooms in town were watched, and any houses he had been known to be in the habit of frequenting. With such a cordon, it seemed impossible that Ralph should be able to evade detection. He had no luggage, and as far as anyone knew, no money. "I can't find anyone who saw him at the station that night," continued the inspector. "And yet he's well known down here, and you'd think somebody would have noticed him. There's no news from Liverpool either." "You think he went to Liverpool?" queried Poirot. "Well, it's on the cards. That telephone message from the station, just 3 minutes before the Liverpool express left, there ought to be something in that. Unless it was deliberately intended to throw you off the scent. That might just possibly be the point of the telephone message." "That's an idea," said the inspector eagerly. "Do you really think that's the explanation of the telephone call?" "My friend," said Poirot gravely, "I do not know. But I will tell you this. I believe that when we find the explanation of that telephone call, we shall find the explanation of the murder." "You said something like that before, I remember," I observed, looking at him curiously. Poirot nodded. "I always come back to it," he said seriously. "It seems to me utterly irrelevant," I declared. "I wouldn't say that," demurred the inspector. "But I must confess I think Mr. Poirot here harps on it a little too much. We've better clues than that. The fingerprints on the dagger, for instance." Poirot became suddenly very foreign in manner, as he often did when excited over anything. "El Inspecteur," he said, "beware of the blind, comment dire, the little street that has no end to it." Inspector Raglan stared, but I was quicker. "You mean a blind alley," I said. "That is it, the blind street that leads nowhere. So it may be with those fingerprints. They may lead you nowhere." "I don't see how that can well be," said the police officer. "I suppose you're hinting that they're faked. I've read of such things being done, though I can't say I've ever come across it in my experience. But fake or true, they're bound to lead somewhere." Poirot merely shrugged his shoulders, flinging out his arms wide. The inspector then showed us various enlarged photographs of the fingerprints and proceeded to become technical on the subject of loops and whorls. "Come now," he said at last, annoyed by Poirot's detached manner. "You've got to admit that those prints were made by someone who was in the house that night." "Bien entendu," said Poirot, nodding his head. "Well, I've taken the prints of every member of the household, every one, mind you, from the old lady down to the kitchen maid. But I don't think Mrs. Ackroyd would enjoy being referred to as the old lady. She must spend a considerable amount on cosmetics." "Every one's," repeated the inspector fussily. "Including mine," I said dryly. "Very well. None of them correspond. That leaves us two alternatives. Ralph Patten or the mysterious stranger the doctor here tells us about. When we get hold of those two—" "Much valuable time may have been lost," broke in Poirot. "I don't quite get you, Mr. Poirot." "You have taken the prints of everyone in the house, you say," murmured Poirot. "Is that the exact truth you are telling me there, M. L'inspecteur?" "Certainly. But without overlooking anyone." "Without overlooking anyone. But the quick or the dead?" For a moment the inspector looked bewildered at what he took to be a religious observation. Then he reacted slowly. "You mean the dead, M. L'inspecteur?" But the inspector still took a minute or two to understand. "I am suggesting," said Poirot placidly, "that the fingerprints on the dagger handle are those of Mr. Ackroyd himself. It is an easy matter to verify. His body is still available." But why? What would be the point of it? You're surely not suggesting suicide, Mr. Poirot." "Ah, no. My theory is that the murderer wore gloves or wrapped something round his hand. After the blow was struck, he picked up the victim's hand and closed it round the dagger handle." But why?" Poirot shrugged his shoulders again. "To make a confusing case even more confusing." Well," said the inspector, "I'll look into it. What gave you the idea in the first place? When you were so kind as to show me the dagger and draw attention to the fingerprints. I know very little of loops and whorls. See, I confess my ignorance frankly. But it did occur to me that the position of the prints was somewhat awkward. Not so would I have held a dagger in order to strike. Naturally, with the right hand brought up over the shoulder backwards, it would have been difficult to put it in exactly the right position." But Inspector Raglan stared at the little man. Poirot, with an air of great unconcern, flecked a speck of dust from his coat sleeve. "Well," said the inspector, "it's an idea. I'll look into it all right, but don't you be disappointed if nothing comes of it." But he endeavoured to make his tone kindly and patronising. Poirot watched him go off. Then he turned to me with twinkling eyes. "Another time," he observed, "I must be more careful of his amour propre. And now that we are left to our own devices, what do you think, my good friend, of a little reunion of the family?" The little reunion, as Poirot called it, took place about half an hour later. We sat round the table in the dining room at Fernley, Poirot at the head of the table, like the chairman of some ghastly board meeting. The servants were not present, so we were 6 in all. Mrs. Ackroyd, Flora, Major Blunt, young Raymond, Poirot and myself. When everyone was assembled, Poirot rose and bowed. "Messieurs, mesdames, I have called you together for a certain purpose." He paused. "To begin with, I want to make a very special plea to Mademoiselle." "But to me," said Flora. "Mademoiselle, you are engaged to Captain Ralph Patten. If anyone is in his confidence, you are. I beg you most earnestly, if you know of his whereabouts, to persuade him to come forward." "1 little minute," as Flora raised her head to speak. "Say nothing till you have well reflected." "Mademoiselle, his position grows daily more dangerous." If he had come forward at once, no matter how damning the facts, he might have had a chance of explaining them away. But this silence, this flight, what can it mean? Surely only one thing, knowledge of guilt. "Mademoiselle, if you really believe in his innocence, persuade him to come forward before it is too late." But Flora's face had gone very white. "Too late," she repeated very low. Poirot leant forward, looking at her. "See now, mademoiselle," he said very gently, "it is Papa Poirot who asks you this. The old Papa Poirot who has much knowledge and much experience. I would not seek to entrap you, mademoiselle. Will you not trust me, and tell me where Ralph Patterne is hiding?" The girl rose and stood facing him. Poirot," she said in a clear voice, "I swear to you, swear solemnly, that I have no idea where Ralph is, and that I have neither seen him nor heard from him either on the day of the murder or since." But she sat down again. Poirot gazed at her in silence for a minute or two. Then he brought his hand down on the table with a sharp rap. "Bien, that is that," he said. His face hardened. "Now I appeal to these others who sit round this table, Mrs. Ackroyd, Major Blunt, Doctor, Shepherd, Mr. Raymond. You are all friends and intimates of the missing man. If you know where Ralph Patterne is hiding, speak out." But there was a long silence. Poirot looked to each in turn. "I beg of you," he said in a low voice, "speak out." But still there was silence, broken at last by Mrs. Ackroyd. "I must say," she observed in a plaintive voice, "that Ralph's absence is most peculiar indeed. Not to come forward at such a time. It looks, you know, as though there was something behind it. I can't help thinking, Flora dear, that it was a very fortunate thing your engagement was never formally announced." "But, mother," cried Flora angrily. "Providence," declared Mrs. Ackroyd. "I have a devout belief in Providence, a divinity that shapes our ends, as Shakespeare's beautiful line runs." "But surely you don't make the Almighty directly responsible for thick ankles, Mrs. Ackroyd, do you?" asked Geoffrey Raymond, his irresponsible laugh ringing out. His idea was, I think, to loosen the tension, but Mrs. Ackroyd threw him a glance of reproach and took out her handkerchief. "Flora has been saved a terrible amount of notoriety and unpleasantness. Not for a moment that I think dear Ralph had anything to do with poor Roger's death. I do think so. But then I have a trusting heart. I always have had ever since a child. I am loath to believe the worst of anyone. But of course, one must remember that Ralph was in several air raids as a young boy. The results are apparent long after. Sometimes they say people are not responsible for their actions in the least. They lose control, you know, without being able to help it." "But, mother," cried Flora, "you don't think Ralph did it?" "Come, Mrs. Ackroyd," said Blunt. "I don't know what to think," said Mrs. Ackroyd tearfully. "It's all very upsetting. What would happen to the estate, I wonder, if Ralph were found guilty?" Raymond pushed his chair away from the table violently. Major Blunt remained very quiet, looking thoughtfully at her. "Like shell shock, you know," said Mrs. Ackroyd obstinately, "and I dare say Roger kept him very short of money, with the best intentions, of course. I can see you are all against me, but I do think it is very odd that Ralph has not come forward, and I must say I am thankful Flora's engagement was never announced formally." "But it will be tomorrow," said Flora in a clear voice. "Flora," cried her mother aghast. Flora had turned to the secretary. "Will you send the announcement to the Morning Post, and the Times, please, Mr. Raymond?" "But if you are sure that it is wise, Miss Ackroyd," he replied gravely. She turned impulsively to Blunt. "You understand," she said. "What else can I do? As things are, I must stand by Ralph. Don't you see that I must?" She looked very searchingly at him, and after a long pause he nodded abruptly. Mrs. Ackroyd burst out into shrill protests. Flora remained unmoved. Then Raymond spoke. "I appreciate your motives, Miss Ackroyd. But don't you think you're being rather precipitate? Wait a day or two." "Tomorrow," said Flora in a clear voice. "It's no good, Mother, going on like this. Whatever else I am, I'm not disloyal to my friends." Poirot," Mrs. Ackroyd appealed tearfully, "can't you say anything at all?" "Nothing to be said," interpolated Blunt. "She's doing the right thing. I'll stand by her through thick and thin." Flora held out her hand to him. "Thank you, Major Blunt," she said. "Mademoiselle," said Poirot, "will you let an old man congratulate you on your courage and your loyalty? And will you not misunderstand me if I ask you most solemnly, to postpone the announcement you speak of for at least 2 days more?" Flora hesitated. "I ask it in Ralph Patton's interests as much as in yours, mademoiselle." You frowned. "You do not see how that can be. But I assure you that it is so. Pas de blagues. You put the case into my hands. You must not hamper me now." Flora paused a few minutes before replying. "I do not like it," she said at last, "but I will do what you say." She sat down again at the table. "And now, messieurs et mesdames," said Poirot rapidly, "I will continue with what I was about to say. Understand this, I mean to arrive at the truth. The truth, however ugly in itself, is always curious and beautiful to the seeker after it. I am much aged, my powers may not be what they were." Here he clearly expected a contradiction. "In all probability this is the last case I shall ever investigate. But Hercule Poirot does not end with a failure. Messieurs et mesdames, I tell you I mean to know. And I shall know in spite of you all." He brought out the last words provocatively, hurling them in our face as it were. I think we all flinched back a little, excepting Geoffrey Raymond, who remained good-humoured and imperturbable as usual. "How do you mean, in spite of us all?" he asked with slightly raised eyebrows. "But just that, monsieur. Every one of you in this room is concealing something from me." He raised his hand as a faint murmur of protest arose. Yes, I know what I am saying. It may be something unimportant, trivial, which is supposed to have no bearing on the case, but there it is. Each one of you has something to hide. Come now, am I right?" His glance, challenging and accusing, swept round the table, and every pair of eyes dropped before his. "Yes, mine as well." "I am answered," said Poirot with a curious laugh. He got up from his seat. "I appeal to you all. Tell me the truth, the whole truth." There was a silence. "Will no one speak?" He gave the same short laugh again. "Say Domage," he said, and went out. Chapter 13. The Goose Quill. That evening, at Poirot's request, I went over to his house after dinner. Caroline saw me depart with visible reluctance. I think she would have liked to have accompanied me. Poirot greeted me hospitably. He had placed a bottle of Irish whiskey, which I detest, on a small table, with a soda-water siphon and a glass. He himself was engaged in brewing hot chocolate. It was a favourite beverage of his, I discovered later. He inquired politely after my sister, whom he declared to be a most interesting woman. "I'm afraid you've been giving her a swelled head," I said dryly. What about Sunday afternoon? He laughed and twinkled. I always like to employ the expert, he remarked obscurely, but he refused to explain the remark. You got all the local gossip anyway, I remarked. True and untrue. And a great deal of valuable information, he added quietly. Such as... He shook his head. Why not have told me the truth, he countered. In a place like this, all Ralph Patton's doings were bound to be known. If your sister had not happened to pass through the wood that day, somebody else would have done so. I suppose they would, I said grumpily. What about this interest of yours in my patients? Again he twinkled. Only one of them, Doctor. Only one of them. The last, I hazarded. I find Miss Russell a study of the most interesting, he said evasively. Do you agree with my sister and Mrs. Ackroyd that there is something fishy about her? I asked. What do you say, fishy? I explained to the best of my ability. And they say that, do they? Didn't my sister convey as much to you yesterday afternoon? Say possible. For no reason whatever, I declared. Les femmes, generalized Poirot. They are marvellous, they invent haphazard, and by miracle they are right. Not that it is that really. Women observe subconsciously 1,000 little details, without knowing that they are doing so. Their subconscious mind adds these little things together, and they call the result intuition. Me, I am very skilled in psychology. I know these things. He swelled his chest out importantly, looking so ridiculous that I found it difficult not to burst out laughing. Then he took a small sip of his chocolate and carefully wiped his moustache. I wish you'd tell me, I burst out, what you really think of it all. He put down his cup. You wish that. I do. You have seen what I have seen. Should not our ideas be the same? I'm afraid you're laughing at me, I said stiffly. Of course, I've no experience of matters of this kind. Poirot smiled at me indulgently. You are like the little child who wants to know the way the engine works. You wish to see the affair, not as the family doctor sees it, but with the eye of a detective who knows and cares for no one, to whom they are all strangers and all equally liable to suspicion. You put it very well, I said. So I give you then a little lecture. The first thing is to get a clear history of what happened that evening, always bearing in mind that the person who speaks may be lying. I raised my eyebrows. Rather a suspicious attitude. But necessary, I assure you necessary. Now first, Doctor. Shepherd leaves the house at 10 minutes to 9. How do I know that? Because I told you so. But you might not be speaking the truth, or the watch you went by might be wrong. But Parker also says that you left the house at 10 minutes to 9. So we accept that statement and pass on. At 9 o'clock you run into a man, and here we come to what we will call the romance of the mysterious stranger, just outside the park gates. How do I know that that is so? I told you so, I began again, but Poirot interrupted me with a gesture of impatience. Ah, but it is that you are a little stupid tonight, my friend. You know that it is so, but how am I to know? A by N, I am able to tell you that the mysterious stranger was not a hallucination on your part, because the maid of a Miss Gannett met him a few minutes before you did, and of her too he inquired the way to Fernley Park. We accept his presence, therefore, and we can be fairly sure of two things about him, that he was a stranger to the neighbourhood, and that whatever his object in going to Fernley, there was no great secrecy about it, since he twice asked the way there. Yes, I said, I see that. Now I have made it my business to find out more about this man. He had a drink at the Three Boars, I learn, and the barmaid there says that he spoke with an American accent and mentioned having just come over from the States. Did it strike you that he had an American accent? Yes, I think he had, I said after a minute or two, during which I cast my mind back, but a very slight one. But precisamente. There is also this which, you will remember, I picked up in the summer house. He held out to me the little quill. I looked at it curiously. Then a memory of something I had read stirred in me. Poirot, who had been watching my face, nodded. Yes, heroin snow. Drug takers carry it like this and sniff it up the nose. But dimorphine hydrochloride, I murmured mechanically. This method of taking the drug is very common on the other side. Another proof, if we wanted one, that the man came from Canada or the States. But what first attracted your attention to that summer house? I asked curiously. My friend the inspector took it for granted that anyone using that path did so as a short cut to the house, but as soon as I saw the summer house, I realized that the same path would be taken by anyone using the summer house as a rendezvous. Now it seems fairly certain that the stranger came neither to the front nor to the back door. Then did someone from the house go out and meet him? If so, what could be a more convenient place than that little summer house? I searched it with the hope that I might find some clue inside. I found too the scrap of cambric and the quill. And the scrap of cambric, I asked curiously. What about that? Poirot raised his eyebrows. You do not use your little grey cells, he remarked dryly. The scrap of starched cambric should be obvious, but not very obvious to me. I changed the subject. Anyway, I said, this man went to the summer house to meet somebody. Who was that somebody? Exactly the question, said Poirot. You will remember that Mrs. Ackroyd and her daughter came over from Canada to live here. Is that what you meant today when you accused them of hiding the truth? Perhaps. Now another point. What did you think of the parlour maid's story? What story? The story of her dismissal. Does it take half an hour to dismiss a servant? Was the story of those important papers a likely one? And remember, though she says she was in her bedroom from 9:30 until 10 o'clock, there is no one to confirm her statement. But you bewilder me, I said. To me it grows clearer. But tell me now your own ideas and theories. But I drew a piece of paper from my pocket. I just scribbled down a few suggestions, I said apologetically. But excellent, you have method. Let us hear them. But I read out in a somewhat embarrassed voice. To begin with, one must look at the thing logically. Just what my poor Hastings used to say, interrupted Poirot, but alas, he never did so. But point no. 1. Mr. Ackroyd was heard talking to someone at 9:30. Point no. 2. At some time during the evening Ralph Patten must have come in through the window, as evidenced by the prints of his shoes. Point no. 3. Mr. Ackroyd was nervous that evening and would only have admitted someone he knew. Point no. 4. The person with Mr. Ackroyd at 9:30 was asking for money. We know Ralph Patten was in a scrape. These 4 points go to show that the person with Mr. Ackroyd at 9:30 was Ralph Patten. But we know that Mr. Ackroyd was alive at 9:45, therefore it was not Ralph who killed him. Ralph left the window open. Afterwards the murderer came in that way. And who was the murderer? Inquired Poirot. The American stranger. He may have been in league with Parker, and possibly in Parker we have the man who blackmailed Mrs. Ferrars. If so, Parker may have heard enough to realize the game was up, have told his accomplice so, and the latter did the crime with the dagger which Parker gave him. But it is a theory that, admitted Poirot. Decidedly you have cells of a kind, but it leaves a good deal unaccounted for. But such as the telephone call, the pushed-out chair. Do you really think the latter important? I interrupted. Perhaps not, admitted my friend. It may have been pulled out by accident, and Raymond or Blunt may have shoved it into place unconsciously under the stress of emotion. Then there is the missing £40. But given by Ackroyd to Ralph, I suggested. He may have reconsidered his first refusal. But that still leaves one thing unexplained. What? Why was Blunt so certain in his own mind that it was Raymond with Mr. Ackroyd at 9:30? He explained that, I said. You think so, I will not press the point. Tell me instead, what were Ralph Patton's reasons for disappearing? That's rather more difficult, I said slowly. I shall have to speak as a medical man. Ralph's nerves must have gone fut. If he suddenly found out that his uncle had been murdered within a few minutes of his leaving him, after perhaps a rather stormy interview, well, he might get the wind up and clear right out. Men have been known to do that, act guiltily when they're perfectly innocent. But yes, that is true, said Poirot. But we must not lose sight of one thing. But I know what you're going to say, I remarked. Motive. Ralph Patton inherits a great fortune by his uncle's death. But that is one motive, agreed Poirot. One, mais oui. Do you realize that there are 3 separate motives staring us in the face? Somebody certainly stole the blue envelope and its contents. That is one motive. Blackmail. Ralph Patton may have been the man who blackmailed Mrs. Ferrars. Remember, as far as Hammond knew, Ralph Patton had not applied to his uncle for help of late. That looks as though he were being supplied with money elsewhere. Then there is the fact that he was in some, how do you say, scrape, which he feared might get to his uncle's ears. And finally there is the one you have just mentioned. But, dear me, I said, rather taken aback. The case does seem black against him. But does it, said Poirot. That is where we disagree, you and I. 3 motives, it is almost too much. I am inclined to believe that, after all, Ralph Patton is innocent.